Welcome to the 10th Multi-Stakeholder Forum on Science, Technology and Innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals. And welcome to this side event, the launch of a joint UN Futures Lab and International Science Council report on futures thinking and strategic foresight in action, insights from the Global South. Welcome participants and welcome to our esteemed panelists. Today we're going to be doing three things in our time together. First thing we're going to do is give you an overview of the report itself. One of the things that I love about this report is it draws on insights, experiences, and perspectives of diversity of people, organizations, and stakeholders from around the world. It gives us a lot to think about when we consider our current approaches to futures thinking and strategic foresight, and gives us even more to think about in terms of how we further develop tools, approaches, and processes to think about the future and turn those insights into action. The second thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to draw on the insights and experiences from our panelists. They're going to be sharing their thoughts about the report. They're going to be sharing their learnings from creating this report. Then we're going to move to an open discussion, and this is where we're going to be using Mentimeter to make this session more interactive, to gather your thoughts as participants, your thoughts as the audience, and your insights. So we're going to have an open floor discussion, and for that we're going to be using Mentimeter, a digital tool which will enable all of us to share our insights. And then the last thing that we're going to be doing is we're going to ask two of the report leads, Ms. Alana Poole, who's the Deputy Head of the UN Futures Lab, and Anne-Sophie, who's a Senior Science Officer from the International Science Council. I'm going to, first of all, walk you through some of the insights from the report that is being released. And so to begin with, just to give you a bit of background to the report itself, it's a report that explores how futures thinking and strategic foresight are being applied in diverse contexts from across the Global South to build resilience, improve governance, and inform long-term decision-making. The report draws on 14 case studies from Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Pacific, and it highlights locally driven foresight practices, including indigenous knowledge, participatory scenario planning, and technological innovation that challenge top-down models and offer transferable lessons for global policymaking. The initiative was really grounded in the momentum of the UN Summit of the Future of 2024 and the Pact for the Future, in which we were advocating for a more anticipatory and inclusive multilateral system. The report reinforces that foresight is not just a methodology, but a transformative approach to governance and social innovation, especially when led by communities historically marginalized in global decision-making. Now, first thing that we recognize is that there's no one-size-fits-all approach. And so the report presents 14 diverse case studies. We highlight 8 practical typologies of foresight impact. We highlight 6 key recommendations for inclusive foresight, and we explore some of the key foresight tools and approaches that were taken within all of the case studies. Let me just expand on that first point around foresight not being a one-size-fits-all process or approach. So we glean from the case studies that approaches need to be context-specific, reflecting local histories, ecosystems, and governance cultures. We highlight that there are rich foresight traditions that are practical, participatory, and adaptive, often more inclusive than in some of the more dominant models that we've seen emerging over the past decades. We highlight that local knowledge is vital, that indigenous and community-based knowledge systems are essential for intergenerational thinking and climate adaptation, in particular highlighting case studies seen in India, Bolivia, and New Zealand. We recognize that participation drives legitimacy, and through the empowerment of youth, women, and marginalized communities, foresight can help to build trust. It can help to improve outcomes and can lead to more equitable policies. We recognize that foresight can catalyze institutional reform, and we recognize technology can be an enabler. Now, when we dive into the case studies themselves, there are 14 of them. And we identify 8 typologies. And so at the top left, we can see local and indigenous knowledge, sources and practices. Moving across to the right, building local capacities and durable solutions from community-led initiatives. Again, looking at multi-stakeholder partnerships and collaborations. And then fourth, organizational development. Now, I think what we've found with the case studies is that there are 4 more typologies which we dug into. And so starting with sector-wide policy development and innovation, moving through to futures empowered by technological advancements and innovation, improving social outcomes and social well-being for marginalized community, and of course, rebuilding narratives. And so for us, we found the typologies approach particularly useful because we found ways to cut across all 14 of the case studies. However, what we found was that when we'd consume the case studies, when we'd analyze the case studies, that we wanted to end with at least some recommendations for inclusive foresight. And so what we did was we carried out the analysis. We looked at the typologies and we looked at some of the key threads which wound their way through all of the case studies. And we arrived at 6 recommendations for inclusive foresight. And we can dig into these with the panel discussion in just a few minutes. Firstly, we recognize that for inclusive foresight, we need to exercise bold leadership. We need to have a shift in institutional cultures to challenge dominant paradigms and to adapt innovative, futures-oriented approaches. Secondly, we need to invest in science policy society bridges to foster sustained collaboration between researchers, policymakers, and crucially communities for real-world impact. Third, we need to be able to use behavioral and contextual insights that address biases, that can challenge power dynamics, and can highlight local realities to design inclusive and adaptive foresight initiatives. Fourth, of course, we need to embed long-term and participatory thinking. To do this, we need to ensure that diverse voices are heard. This means across gender, age, geography, socioeconomic backgrounds and expertise, of course, starting from the very beginning, starting at the design stage, and even prior to that, identifying where there are challenges that need to be solved. Fifth, we need to build systematic foresight capacity. It's not good enough for us to say we need to use foresight. We also need to invest in that foresight capacity, integrating foresight into education, into leadership pipelines and public sector planning with measurable outcomes. And last but not least, of course, we need to strengthen networks and access to data through which we can cultivate dynamic knowledge ecosystems, particularly among grassroots actors, to scale evidence-based action. And so those are the 6 recommendations that we highlight within the report. I have to say I'm very excited by the release of the report. It's been a long process for us to make sure that we could highlight not only the quality of the processes and the quality of the approaches themselves, but really to dig deep into the data and the analysis and to emerge with some recommendations for inclusive foresight. And so that's what we've been working on over the last 12 months or so. It's been a journey of discovery. It's been certainly a journey of learning for all of us at the ISC and at the UN Futures Lab, and with our group of advisors who really helped to shape how the report moved forwards. So those are our recommendations. Now, you've had enough of listening to me talk. What I'd like to be able to do is bring in our esteemed panelists. And so the first thing that I'm going to do is introduce them. So first of all, we've got Dr. Elena Rovinskaya, who's a program director at the Advancing Systems Analysis Program at the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. Dr. Rovinskaya, you are most welcome to this panel, and it's a pleasure to have you. Secondly, I would like to introduce Ananta Durayappa, who's the inaugural director of the UNESCO Mahatma Gandhi Institute of Education for Peace and Sustainable Development. And of course, Dr. Katindi Siva, who's the founder and executive director of Longview Consult. And so those are going to be the people that I'm posing questions to initially. I'd also like to introduce Ms. Anne-Sophie Stevens, who's the senior science officer and head of unit at the International Science Council, and of course Ms. Alana Poole, who's the deputy head of our UN Futures Lab Global Pulse Global Hub. You're most welcome, all of you, and let's get into the discussion in which we're going to be exploring how future thinking and strategic foresight are being applied across the Global South to tackle complex challenges and inform more resilient, inclusive, and anticipatory governance. So I'm going to be firing some questions at the panelists, which are going to help us to learn how the lessons from these case studies from the Global South should reshape how we apply future thinking and foresight to achieve the SDGs. And so my first question is going to be to Dr. Rovinskaya. Doctor, what should other governments keep in mind when using foresight to shape policy based on your work developing scenarios for industrial development in Kyrgyzstan? Doctor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris, if I may, for this introduction and also for the presentation of the report. And indeed, exciting, very exciting achievement and very interesting insights. I really recommend that everyone has a look at it and learn something from that. I learned a lot personally when I looked at the draft. Yeah, so you asked me about the governments and how the governments could sort of manage and steer the process, right? So, and that's really a tricky question. So it's a good question, an important question. So first of all, to say that the government, in that case, if they commission a foresight study, they of course very likely to face trade-offs or challenges, such that they of course have some kind of objectives of that study, and at the same time they also have their political objectives. So to resolve that, but those trade-offs that may be involved or are likely to be involved in that setting is not so trivial. I think it would be very useful if they could honestly exchange their practices, their approaches to that, because what is really important for foresight studies, of course, as I'm sure everybody in this call would agree, is that we ensure impartiality and inclusivity of the process. Only then, of course, it can deliver a high quality result. So related to that is often the tendency would be to look for something simple, for simple outcomes, for simple processes. That also is something that I think governments should keep in mind, that may not be necessarily the best way to proceed. So, for example, in our case, when we developed this foresight study for Kyrgyzstan, we used scenario planning and scenario building approaches. And as I'm sure colleagues know here, sometimes they rely on so-called 2x2 scenario matrix, which gives you 4 possible scenarios. So in our case, we concluded that that would be too simple for the purposes of that exercise. So one should be open to increase complexity, even, of course, when it comes at a certain cost. Another aspect is to plan robust interventions. So why do we develop scenarios? We want to plan such that we are prepared for multiple futures. So then we need methods and we need approaches to come up with such robust interventions. So those which will work across multiple futures, right? So again, we should develop our capacity to actually do that as researchers, but also governments to accept such kind of approach. Again, in our case, I think this worked rather well. But one should see how to also enhance that. And then my last point I want to make is that, again, I'm sure many would agree with that, very often results of foresight studies become obsolete very quickly. So the future studies are intrinsically tackling those questions that are very, very uncertain. And of course, our reality is developing so fast that it's very difficult to prepare the study that would cover all possible or plausible futures that one can see. So something changes in real life, and that changes, of course, the relevance of the study. So ideally, we could suggest for governments to have an ongoing process of foresight, such that the scenarios can be updated based on what happens in the real world outside of us. So I would stop here, and these 4 recommendations, I think, would be good to also hear what others are thinking about it. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much for sharing those insights, Doctor. Rich in experience and depth. So thank you for sharing that with us. I wanted to take a little bit of a different tack now, and Dr. Anantha Durayappa, what I wanted to ask of you is really to draw on the experience that AI is presenting to strategic foresight. And so what I wanted to ask is, with AI and rapid technological change, what's been your experience in using foresight to reimagine and redesign education systems? Over to you, Doctor.
Well, thank you, Chris. It's a really tough question that you have posed in terms of, especially with AI, in the sense we are in the early days of how it's impacting everything that we do. I think one of the things that we know for sure, and with high certainty, is the degree of uncertainty in the future. That we know for sure. And one of the things with, and I want to focus on education, is that things that emerge as we move forward, and especially with technology, with AI, with the overload of information, AI providing all kinds of so-called solutions, many of which will need to be questioned as well, because remember, it is all generated from past data that has been generated by us. So it kind of provides, I think, an environment of anxiety that I think that this is what we know for sure in the future, especially in the education system, and we already see this happening, the rise in anxiety, the rise in fear, the rise in aggression, the rise in depression. This is all cutting across at many levels within the education system, starting from the very young. Like, I was very surprised to hear of WHO statistics that was saying that 25% of kids between the age of 13 and 15 in India have some form of mental health problem. That's huge, and that's going to have a huge impact. And AI is not going to help elevate that. In fact, it's going to create a lot more. It's going to actually be a multiplier in terms of how this thing really racks up. So, the thing that I wanted to bring in this intervention is the notion of emotional resiliency. And I think that's one of the terms that I kind of found missing in many of the case studies. I think some of them allude to, but the emotional resiliency is important. We talk about ecological resiliency, but what about emotional resiliency? And so when it comes to that, then we come down to the very traditional model in terms of education. We look at competencies. Now, what we have been focusing on for the last 300 years with this modern education system is numeracy and literacy. If you look at all the time, we just sort of see what are the numeracy levels, what are the literacy levels. But now we are starting to recognize that the competency in social-emotional competencies are extremely important. And these are ones that are going to really build the notion of emotional resiliency. And if you're doing any foresight study, that's something that is really essential. And if you're talking about mindset change, and I really like that first key finding, you need a mindset change. What was that famous saying? You're not going to find solutions with the kinds of minds that created the problems. from the people who have created those problems. You got to get some new real mindset changes. And to do that, I think you really need to start building those competencies. And I'll finish off with, I think, the 4 competencies that we thought were very, very critical. One is emotion regulation, which is really in terms of recognizing emotions, understanding emotions and managing emotions. And that comes to then self-regulation. I'm not sure if you do a self-introspection, how many of us have those competencies. I'll have to say I'm still at a very early stage. My wife will support that as well, in terms of how well I'm emotionally linked with it. Then the second one, which is a little bit more difficult, comes for empathy. And when I talk about empathy, it's about perspective taking, understanding the other from their perspective, not from your own perspective. And this is where the problem is. And when you go to any negotiations or any kind of participatory processes, it's really important. The whole art of listening, I don't think we do that. So the whole thing is we are waiting for the person to say something, and then immediately we say what we have, rather than really listening to that person and sort of say, I'm trying to understand how this person is thinking and why they're saying this, and trying to understand from their perspective. You don't have to accept it, but at least to understand, and that's one of the essentials of empathy training. And then the last one, which is also very difficult, is no, I've got another one, but that's kind of the surprise one from the bag. It's before I go to that. So there's compassion. Compassion is putting into action on empathy. So you don't want to be an empathetic couch check. You sort of say, oh yeah, I understand, I recognize, I empathize with you, and then just go about doing whatever you want to do. You got to do something. That's the action, compassion. I would say acts of kindness would be one of those. So the fourth one, which I think is really important, is the notion of critical inquiry. And to do critical inquiry really well, you need to have emotion regulation and empathy and compassion. Surprisingly, because many people think that's a purely cognitive exercise, but it's not. It's actually completely related with emotions and cognition. So these are what I call the EMC squared approach to building the foundational competencies if you're trying to instill foresight studies, thinking out of the box, thinking for the future, and not being controlled by the biases or the heuristic and cognitive biases of the past. And so these, what I'm kind of pushing for, are essential foundational competencies that we need to build into the educational system.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I feel like I learned an awful lot in that very short space of time. Thank you, Doctor. We're going to take a different tack again, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Dr. Katindi Sivi, who's the founder and executive director of Longview Consult. So, Katindi, based on the experience developing scenarios with specifically civil society organizations in Kenya, what's the biggest challenge and how can we overcome resistance to less comfortable scenarios? Doctor, you have the floor.
All right, thank you very much, and congratulations to the UN Futures Lab for this milestone. So yes, my work was on the context of Kenya. This was about 12 years ago. And basically, just to give a short preview of the work, Kenya civil society organizations were a bit worried because there was an election and they were feeling like the government was really, constricting, the incoming government was going to constrict the civic space. And so they wanted to have a discussion about how, as governance organizations, will they navigate that seemingly hostile environment? And therefore, we did 4 scenarios, and it was very interesting because the people in the room were experts in the work that they do. They had been, championing for, an open civic space in the 90s. And therefore, having helped the country transition to that phase, it was interesting to have these people in the room to have those discussions. Now, one of the things, obviously, that was interesting for me in these 4 scenarios is that as they were, very worried about the governance space, actually data was showing that their biggest threat was actually going to be financing. And that when you look at, of course, international donors. Of course, 100% of their financing was coming from donors, and data was already beginning to show that that was shrinking. It was very interesting because when we were having this discussion, they seemed to then go back to history. And during the 90s, obviously, when the space was constricted, more money was actually given to civil society organizations to champion for an open space. And therefore, that history is something they clung on to quite a lot. And they kept saying, okay, if the space shrinks, then obviously civil society is an important, sector. And obviously, then we see a scenario where actually money is going to overflow, like in the 90s, and not shrink. So various lessons from that. Obviously, now looking back in hindsight, a few of the organizations have closed. And a lot of them was not because of the targeting, but because of the resourcing. And it was very interesting for me as I reflected on this, because it began to show me a very interesting trait that we have. And just to answer your question, Chris, that there's something that has been coined, a terminology that has been coined by Sohail Inayatullah that says, the weight of the past. And the weight of the past is really the hold that we have but from the past, because of the past success, and the fact that that past success actually becomes our undoing when we start thinking about, the future, because it doesn't allow us, it may not allow us to actually explore different alternatives from the success that we have had. So in essence, we hold on to the anchors and the things that made us successful, hoping that that is what will continue shaping the future. And therefore, the weight of the past is something that was very interesting in coming out of these scenarios, because basically the scenarios were highlighting, an uncomfortable truth that perhaps they were not ready to face. The second thing I think is based in this exercise, we had people who are really accomplished in their work. And one of the interesting dangers I have seen in my experience is that actually expertise, as good as it is in doing this work, can actually work against you, because then we are overconfident about the abilities we bring to the table. And sometimes we are not very keen to actually explore other ideas that are counter-narrative to our expertise. And sometimes it's a threatening thought, because it's challenging things that we have invested in over a period of time. I think the other one is the issue about contextual grounding. And a lot of times when we do foresight work, we do emphasize that you need to understand the context in which this work is being done. But in our case, the contextual grounding actually became a gap, in the sense that it began to make us very inward looking, and we actually were very limited in terms of exploring the contextual environment, meaning the bigger environment which is coming at us, the environment that is in a sense determining some of the things that will happen to us outside our control. And so that's very interesting to me to note. And the last one is actually the timing of the exercise. We did this in an election year, so obviously, intuition, temperatures, all manner of, biases have begun to kick in because of the external environment around us. And I feel like if we had done this exercise outside the threat of a government that might come in to challenge us, I think we would have been more, balanced in our thinking. But so because we are doing it at the time where we are facing a real threat, it's self-preserving to actually think about to keep away stories that we don't want to hear, and to actually, embrace what might give us more hope, because that's the hope we are latching on to. So that's my experience. Allow me to end there, and I'll be happy to answer any questions, but those were interesting lessons for us to carry forward as we think about foresight in the context of, different aspects. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Katindi. I'm actually going to stay with you, if I may, because I want to move us into the second round. And what I wanted to push you on a little bit was around that contextualization, and specifically, and so this experience that you've had was extremely rich, and I take the point on context, but so one of the areas that that the UN is really grappling with is behavioral science. And so what I wanted to ask you, Katindi, is how can we better integrate behavioral science and the contextualization into foresight processes? Is that something you've got experience of? Is that something that you think we should be looking at more closely? Please share your knowledge if you feel comfortable. Over to you, Katindi.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of us obviously come to foresight with different postures. And that's why I mentioned the issue of timing, because if the posture is wrong, the outcome will definitely be skewed towards, the biases that we have. So one of the things that I note about this behavioral science is the whole question around our cognitive biases, obviously, but this skewed decision-making. And therefore, there's a posture there to be said about our mindset and how we think. And I really appreciate the thinkers that were coming ahead of us. So the question around to what extent are we aware of the biases that we have? And to what extent then can we actually call those out? And from the beginning of the workshop, then be able to actually say, this is something that this is my belief system. This is what I bring to the table. But obviously, the way then we design foresight exercises has to be such a safe space for us then not to compete with ideas, meaning that I can safely state my position, even if it is not politically correct, and feel safe enough to be able to explore that amidst other narratives. And so that mindset, not that mindset, but that view is actually taken into account. Because what happens is we say the politically correct things within these meetings, and then what begins to happen is the truth doesn't come out. What I have found, though, is this happens a lot when you work with experts, but when you work with communities that have lived experiences and that have nothing to lose, and even when you work with children, there's a certain inhibition that they don't have, and therefore that honesty is so powerful to bring to the table when you're doing foresight, because without that, then there are a few elements that are hidden, and therefore you don't get authentic stories. I think the other one is just the usual what we say about incorporating everyone in the ecosystem. Again, it comes to the design question. And the design question is, for example, in this case, because we had experts, we didn't have, for example, someone from the donor agency sitting in the room and actually doing a reality check and saying, actually, we've started receiving budget cuts. So that having everyone represented in the ecosystem is obviously very interesting. But also another thing I have found in this behavioral science is we work in silos a lot, and it's something we have to deconstruct. Our education system, I keep saying, was for the industrial era, and therefore people were taught to do, line thinking. And therefore, when we build scenarios, even as much as we congregate people to try and do foresighting and do outside the thinking, outside the box thinking, when you get to strategy, what tends to happen is that people forget all about the scenarios and pick up their biases and then make strategy. So I think we need to have better linkages between obviously the scenarios and the strategy, so that you're able to have a better linkage. But my last one is the whole question around even the way we communicate and our interventions has a lot to do with our psychology. So there's a program I run called Clarity 4D, not any advertisement at all, but people have different personalities. So if you're a blue, you're more analytical. If you're a red, there's a way you like things being done. If you're a yellow, you're complete sunshine, do not like heavy narratives, etc. etc. Those are interesting. So if I am communicating to a yellow, who is sunshine, needs little detail because they'll veer off to something else, but I'm giving them all these facts and they're the decision maker, you're going to have a disconnect in the way the scenario is actually communicated. And even when you run workshops, we never take time to check, okay, who do I have in the room? What is their predisposition? And therefore, how do I curate this in a way that actually gets everybody, I communicate in the way everybody understands or is natural to them, so that I get the best out of all the participants. So there's all this science going on. So think about a duck that is in the waters and is busy paddling. We don't, even in scenarios thinking, we are not doing enough to understand the paddling underneath, so that as we do our scenarios, we are swimming quite well. So that's my take on yeah, the behavioral science bit of things, that we need to do a lot more, even in foresight thinking.
That was perfect. Thank you, Katindi. I'm probably more of a yellow myself, actually. The narratives are just I don't consume them particularly well, I have to say. But listen, one thing that I wanted to pick up on of many of the interesting insights that you provided gives us a link to Dr. Anantha, actually, and this was on education. And so, Dr. Anantha, what I wanted to ask is, okay, so what are the most effective starting points for embedding futures and foresight capacity within education systems? Over to you, sir.
Oh, okay. For some reason, I have this huge screen looking at my own self. That's kind of putting me off. So let me see how I'm going to try to do this. So education, I think CV kind of put a lot of stuff out there on the table in terms of the biases and the cognitive biases. And as we move into the technology era, especially digital technology and with AI, those biases, if you're not trained, those biases can really set in. Talking about heuristic biases where the lazy brain just doesn't want to do the work. It just takes the first thing that comes across and sort of makes decisions, which is easy to make, and so forth. But as with more and more information, actually it requires a lot more focus, a lot more thinking, a lot more out of the box questioning of what's out there and what's been provided. And as you can see, what's going on right now around the world, I'm not going to point to any particular situation in the world, but I am sure everybody will know what I'm going to be talking about, is that this is all kind of driven by a lot of biases in terms of just taking at the surface certain causalities and then coming up to these conclusions and then acting on those rather than really doing a deep dive. So in the education, so based on my time at UNESCO MGIP, at a very early on, and I had the privilege of being the first director, so I didn't have any baggage to carry on. And because it was a very young institute, I didn't have too much oversight from headquarters, so I could do whatever I wanted to do and nobody was paying attention. So that was good. And so we kind of asked ourselves, look, do we want to continue with just telling peace education, sustainability is good? We know all this stuff, but people are not doing it. And why are they not doing it, and so forth. And then started coming to those competencies that I talked about. Now, we would like to, when you talk about education, it's a surprising thing is actually we are born, neurobiologically, we are born to be kind and compassionate. And they've done this across all kinds of cultures with little kids, toddlers, and they find that they are all very kind and compassionate. And then at the age of 2 or 3, we start changing a little. And what we sort of say is we kind of start cognitively thinking, what should I say, thinking of what the person would like me to say. So you're already falling into this whole process of feeding into and I think CV highlighted some of these factors, rather than sort of saying, hey, calling a spade, all right? That's what I'm kind of alluding to. So we have to intervene very young. And I think even at preschool, we actually have programs and it's starting to scale up. And then at very young, but we have to be very careful because we are dealing with the 3-pound mass that we carry within the head, and you don't want to mess it up very early on with inappropriate teaching materials and pedagogies and so forth. So this is where it is very important to have science and evidence actually supporting the kind of interventions that we do at the school. Now, for foresight, I was thinking about this a bit when you asked me the question. I would say let's start at 15. I wouldn't say to leave it to at the university, because then you would basically kind of drop out, isolate a lot of people who don't get into the universities. And you want to carry them along when you're talking about participatory approaches and so forth. I would say 15 would be a good age to start. We do a lot of our SEL training when we first starting at about the age of 15 or so, and it's been very, very effective in terms of what the impact has been. A 10-week intervention already shows huge differences, not just from surveys, but even from when you actually put them under fMRIs and see changes in the neural structures in their brain and stuff, you can actually see changes. And it's been well documented and published extensively. So that's the good news. There's hope. So I would say start at 15, build on the competencies that I've talked about, but build it from an active participatory curriculum, not boring curriculum where, like what we have right now. It's participatory, it's in terms of teacher, students, teacher interaction. Now, we're looking at a whole, if you're talking about foresight, one of the things that we tried on is not focus on solve foresight in particular, but in terms of a project, a whole great project. And this is something that you could introduce as a foresight exercise. What do you see for your future? How do you see that future evolving? What are the things that you would need? And then get them to, they don't have to write it. They can do it out in a play. They can do it out in a song. Leave it open so that the kids are comfortable doing what they want to. And then as you go older, you can become more structured at the university. It can become more structured and so forth. Now, one of the things that we always say is make it fun, because then you'll have buy-in. Make it relevant, so then they know that this actually has an impact. And one of the things that you could do, which is now gaining, is gamify it. So you kind of make it like into a game. Remember, play is very, very natural to us. And we learn a lot through play. And so if you gamify it, they're playing. And that's one of the ways of building these competencies. So I would kind of stop there and sort of maybe have, more than willing to ask questions. But I've got some I think later on, maybe Chris, the behavioral science is the one that is really key to in terms of changing mindset, biases. It's interesting. You can bring all the evidence that you want, all the science that you want, and yet you won't get people to change. Why? We can't say they're stupid, which is what we are sort of saying. We can't say they are idiotic. There are reasons why they are, and sometimes valid reasons, but we need to understand that. And most of the times it's actually out of fear. It is really out of fear. And if we understand that fear, we can actually address the issue at hand. Climate change would be a perfect example on how to do one of the things, I'm not sure if many of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment that we did, which was commissioned by Kofi Annan in 2000, we did, I think it was a good, and then after which then we said, you know what, we should do a Millennium Assessment on human behavior. I have two questions that I would like. Why do we do what we do? And why do we think what we think? I'll stop there.
Thanks, Ananta. Great questions to end on. I could probably listen to you and Katindi speak for hours, if not days. I always learn an awful lot from the two of you. I also want to bring Dr. Rovanskaya back into the conversation, because Ananta, when you were talking about 15 being perhaps an age that would be ideal to start to bring futures and foresight into education, participatory methods, and so on and so forth. Of course, one of the things that that we found from this report is that foresight processes coupled with inclusivity focused on long-term impact tend to come up with quite positive results or quite positive outcomes. And so, Dr. Robinskaya, what I'm going to ask you now is how can we ensure that foresight processes are inclusive and focused on long-term impact? Over to you, please.
Yes, indeed. And yeah, that's obviously a very important recommendation from this report. And also it has two parts, inclusivity and long-term impact. And the inclusivity, of course, is a necessary condition for long-term impact, of course. So inclusivity, there is a lot of literature on this, how to make participatory processes, foresight exercises inclusive. There are a number of, let's say, more commonly given pieces of advice, such as, for example, holding foresight workshops in those locations where where it makes sense, where it's relevant. So, for example, in our case, the foresight exercise that was used as an example in the report was actually done at the national level. So the goal was to develop or to support the development of an industrial strategy of a country, Kyrgyzstan in Central Asia. And even though this was done at the national level, so we actually had workshops in regions, and of course, what we learned that all regions were, of course, very different, and expectations and opportunities in those regions were also very, very different, even in such a small country as relatively small country as Kyrgyzstan. Obviously, one should ensure participation of a wide range of stakeholders. Of course, there is a lot of literature on stakeholder mapping, how to choose those stakeholders. I think, again, many of colleagues who are present here in this meeting are very well aware of that. But it's important to remind ourselves about that, because it's, of course, not so easy to engage, at least, especially some type of stakeholders. So it's really important to reiterate the importance of this. Making materials accessible, there is always this issue of different languages. In which language should this exercise be held, and how to involve people who speak different languages. In some settings, especially, it's extremely important, and care should be given to those considerations. Something that we learned from our exercise, which perhaps is a little bit less obvious, is about the use of visualizations in the process. So we found that one could be really very creative in anchoring visualizations that we use in culture, in the culture that we work with, which obviously should, and I think in our case we can confirm, reduce alienation to external people. So let's say us, who as researchers who facilitate the exercise, but also it helps to kind of improve the intuitive understanding of the core ideas of the foresight exercise or scenarios. For example, if we apply these visuals to visualize different scenarios. I just give a simple example, one example from our experience. So for one scenario, we had 6 scenarios. For one scenario, we used the name modern yurt. And yurt is a portable circular tent that traditionally used as a dwelling in that region, so for nomadic people in Central Asia. And so we combined this traditional notion of a yurt with the word modern. So in order to actually communicate that in that particular scenario for which we use that name, the scenario was about how industrial development could actually thrive and drive economic welfare by being inclusive and culturally grounded in that country. So the name actually was, the intention was to communicate that with that name and evoke notions like resilience, adaptability, sustainability, community-oriented living, and so on. So names like this, of course, are very tricky to create. So it may not be so easy. However, when a good name is found, I think that can really help to also address that inclusivity question. Of course, also I should say that such metaphors should be used with care, and it's easy to also misuse them, let's say. So it's really, again, a delicate area where one should be really careful. On the long-term impact, yeah, that's always a challenge for foresight studies, how to ensure that their outcomes lead to really long-term impact. I can repeat already what I said before in this context, that I think more kind of institutionalized process, a process that ensures continuity, ensures, for example, that scenarios can be updated regularly in response to different things that happen in the outside world through an institutional process, obviously can help to reduce that risk of, for example, that comes from electoral cycles and changing powers and things like this, shifting priorities and so on. But it's not a silver bullet, clearly. So it's, yeah, it is an issue. And I also very much agree with previous speakers that eventually, if you can enhance the, let's say, futures literacy, if more people would actually understand how these future studies work, what's their value, also what's their limitations, for sure. So then it would be easier for those studies to actually positively and meaningfully influence the political process. Thank you. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you so very, very much for sharing those lessons and insights with us. So listen, we've done a couple of rounds of experiences and lessons learned, looking at recommendations. We've covered everything from ducks to yurts, and we've posed some really pertinent questions, such as why do we do what we do? So thanks for those two questions, and Anthony, I think you set us up quite nicely, the three of you, to get into the Mentimeter. And so this is an opportunity for our audience participants to ask some questions. And so what we're going to put to you, the audience, is one question. So let's hear from you. So of the 6 practical recommendations from the report, which ones are you currently putting into practice in your own work? So we're asking that question to you all. There is a QR code in the on the slide here, which you can scan using smartphones. Or what you can do is go to menti.com, and then there's a code 51258712, which is where you can also post your answers, but you can also ask questions of the panelists, because I know there will be many thoughts from all of us. Some of the all of the interventions were particularly insightful and inspiring, and so please do also feel free to ask questions of the panelists as well. So first of all, you have a question, which is, of the 6 practical recommendations in the report, which ones are you currently putting into practice in your own foresight work? And then secondly, you can ask questions of the panelists as well. Yes, that's a very, very good point. If we could cut and paste the list of recommendations, first of all, into the chat, that would be super useful, so that people know what they're answering the question about. So on the right-hand side, we can already start to see some of the results from the Mentimeter, and so where we see higher numbers of folks who are voting on this. This is the second recommendation: invest decisively in collaborations between scientists, policymakers, and communities to drive faster real-world impact. Sorry, my eyes are getting a little bit old these days. So that was one of the more popular recommendations. In terms of who's using that recommendation in their own work. The one that seems to be coming out on top at the moment is embed inclusive participation and long-term thinking at all levels. And of course, when we think all levels, we really do mean all levels here. I think there's been a tendency that we've seen across our work at the UN is, you know, you do have high level kind of engagement, particularly when we've been carrying out work on multi-year strategic plans. We do see like very high engagement from depending on how you view hierarchy, but those who are at kind of the top of the pyramid in terms of decision making and so on and so forth. And one thing that we've been really clear on with our leadership and our colleagues and friends and so on and so forth is that inclusivity needs to be at all levels, from the folks working in country operations right the way up or down to those in headquarters positions who are perhaps making more strategic decisions. And so what we're saying is that is one of the more popular areas in terms of how you are all using strategic foresight that kind of aligns with our report. Now, I would like to pause here and see actually whether there are questions from the audience. I can see the chat is there's some back and forth on the chat, but I wanted to pause and see first of all if there were any folks who wanted to pose questions to the panelists. You can raise your hands and we will certainly call on you for your question, or you can put questions in the chat if you want to make a comment or ask a question of the panelists. I'm just going to scan through our participants and see if there are any hands that have gone up in response to the points that the panelists were making. And I'm also looking at the chat to see if any questions are coming in here. If not, then I'm going to ask the panelists some more questions because I've got loads of them, but I don't want to monopolize. I'm going to just pause a little bit, see if there are questions from the audience, either in the chat or whether you want to raise your hands in due course. Should we answer now? Sure. Linda, did you want to come in and make a point here? If so, the floor is yours. No, yep, please, Linda, the floor is yours. Just unmute yourself, and then if your camera is working, we'd love to see your face as well. Linda, the floor is yours. Doesn't seem to be working, Linda. Maybe there's a little technical glitch here. We'll take a look at that. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask Katindi another question for you, if I may, because it's been a while since I saw you. So I'm going to take full advantage of this time together. All right. So when we're thinking about, and you did touch on this, what roles do different stakeholders have in foresight processes, and how can we ensure that we have meaningful collaboration across the different stakeholder groups? And really, I'm thinking about science, policy, civil society, businesses, and so on and so forth. So that question is for you, Katindi. Over to you.
All right. Yeah. So the issue about stakeholders is interesting because one of the things is a design question, in the sense that a lot of times we design scenarios, not scenarios, but just foresight workshops to be like an hour, 2 hours. So in that sense, you can't really get to everyone. And so my own recommendation is that, look, if you're going to cut the forest and you have this axe, just spend time sharpening your axe. What that means is spend time in designing the process and invest. And sometimes I think we're under the notion that it costs a lot of money, but actually, if you just engage people in conversations at different levels, you can actually get as many people's perspectives as possible. So design is a big one in terms of just how people get engaged. A lot of times we tend then to rely on, maybe experts, and then we then have this echo chamber way of doing the workshop where we just bring in, let's say, people who think alike, and obviously that falls apart. So that issue of also taking into account, and I really like the submission that was talking about different levels, that is quite important. And therefore, the point here is to make sure that you bring in intersectionality and make sure that you are surfacing different conversations. What I have found in terms of getting people to discuss. And the other thing is, you don't have to have everybody in the room. You can design different workshops for different people so that you collect the information and triangulate information. I think we underestimate the power of lived experiences. And the one thing that I have found is that people don't experience the same thing the same way. So, and first of all, framing conversations is important, because when we bring people into the room, we start off by doing the scenarios, not understanding that actually, if I just ask, what is education? There's somebody thinking about education in terms of going to school, because in my context, for example, finishing high school is a big deal, right? But so I'm thinking about that transition, but somebody else is thinking about life and what life lessons are. So if you put those two people in the room and just start a conversation on education, you will be speaking at cross purposes, but you have the feeling that you are addressing the same thing. So framing is important, because, and that framing has then to go into how do different people experience this issue, and capturing that is one of the most important things when it comes to making sure that then there's that participation. And participation doesn't have to be physical. It's just accounting for those different experiences in foresighting exercises.
Excellent. Thank you so very, very much for that, Katindi. Really appreciated that. And intersectionality is of course crucial to these efforts. So thanks for highlighting that, especially. All right. Listen, I've just been just had a bit of a reminder of time, and I realize that people are going to need to move on to other pressing issues. But there are two people in the virtual room who we haven't heard from yet, who are crucial to this report's development. First of all is Anne-Sophie Stevens from the International Science Council. And Sophie, I wanted to hand the floor over to you to begin with, and maybe if you could share some of the perspectives from yourself, also from the International Science Council, on the report. What were some of the key learnings you took from it, and what were some of the unusual insights that you took from the report? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chris, and great to see everyone online. Thank you for joining. So indeed, it's been a very good journey of learning with that experience of really going into the practice of foresight and the diversity. So we were quite agnostic about methods. We were really open about diverse approach with a focus on the global south, given that it's not always been foregrounded in global discussions. And we also we know that when we establish foresight processes, who we invite at the table, whose perspective we're bringing forward, has bearings on how we frame the issues and how we act upon those. So it's been also for us from the ISC side a bit of an introspective look on how we gather, how we convene this kind of process, especially with foresight that is about understanding possible changes in the future, possible trajectories, and try to shape change. So there's something of a responsibility also in how we convene and bring foresight approaches together. That's been at the forefront of our minds, and I think we will very much align with the Futures Lab on that. And it's just interesting in the conversation just now as well that it's not only about what issues can foresight identify through what methods, but it also questions how we learn, how we engage with information, how we listen to risk, because often foresight is also about bringing possible negative learnings about how things might change in negative ways. And we found that there's been, in a way, insufficient attention on those aspects of how we engage with information, how we interpret it, and how we act upon that. And I think the panel discussion today has been really good at lifting those behavioral, cultural dimensions of how people engage in foresight. That I think remains to be, dig deeper. And I think we've helped point to some of those aspects going forward. So it's been a very good learning experience. And the last point I would make is also, where do we go from, with foresight processes? How do we embed that in decision making more broadly? And what are some of the institutional dimensions around science policy, societal interfaces, and mechanisms that allow also to draw on evidence across different stakeholder groups on a more ongoing basis to have those dialogues and enable impact of foresight. Because in some of the case studies that we've found emerge, it's been discrete workshops, discrete processes that were not necessarily embedded institutionally. And we've been working also really hard in sort of bringing that science policy societal interface in how we do science and how science interface with policy at different scales. That is, I think, quite core also to embedding foresight more strongly in decision making. So thank you very much to all the participants, Futures Lab, for the wonderful collaborations, and the experts that have shared their insights through this report and this process.
Thank you so much. That was super interesting. Thank you for that. I'm going to the second person that I would like to bring into the discussion is Alana, who has been really instrumental in pulling all of the different threads together when it comes to this report. And so we really need to say a sincere thank you to you, Alana, in the first instance. But secondly, same questions to you. What were some of the key insights that you took from this report? What were some of the perhaps some of the unusual aspects that you weren't expecting going into this project? And really looking to you, Alana, to give us a little bit of a closing out here. So Alana, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Chris, and thank you, Anne-Sophie. It's been a wonderful partnership, and I'm very proud of the process, the case studies, and the report. And really, this is just the start of a conversation that will continue, I think, for some time. And as we've heard from the panelists, the case studies and the experiences that we showcase in the report, I mean, really the value that comes from it is their lived experiences. And I think what we, at the UN Futures Lab have certainly been wrestling with over the past year. Again, we're a new entity. But really, how do we ensure that, as Anantha was saying, we can show all the evidence, we can encourage, we can write long reports about the importance of using strategic foresight. But it's that behavioral shift. It's the overcoming the behavioral bias. It's the culture shift, and it's really somehow motivating and ensuring that people want to be engaged in these types of processes. And so this is what we were really searching for with the report. And I think something that drove us, and something that I was so pleased about with the case studies, is this element of humility, because the case studies, there are similarities in the tools that are used, but the ways in which they are applied are very context specific. And the outcomes which they lead to are also very context specific. And what we wanted to show in this is that there is really no one size fits all. We can have a basket of tools at our disposal. We can have similar ways of understanding these different tools and how they might be applied. But really, what we wanted to unpack here was the differences in actually the outcomes and how they can look in different contexts. And I think, Katindi, what you were saying was so interesting about context is so important, but also one can then be almost blinded again by the context that one is in and not see the different levels. And I think what came through with the case studies was it was really, really rich. We received so many, and unfortunately we couldn't include them all in the report. But it was just so wonderful and motivational, actually, to see how many different examples of foresight are being really successfully implemented in different parts of the world. But what we want to do is be honest. It doesn't always work. strategic foresight and futures thinking, it's not the silver bullet to everything. And again, it goes back to this design. Why would we be using it? For what purposes? With whom? What is our time frame? What are the tools at our disposal? Are we able to ensure that this is accessible? Elena, as you were saying, different locations, different languages, all the rest of it. And I think, you know, this issue of participation, inclusivity, diversity, these are all things that are so important. The gender lens, I mean, this is something, you know, that needs to come through so strongly if we are really to be inclusive, diverse, participatory, and all these really important aspects that make foresight and futures thinking successful and ultimately have impact. So just to say, you know, moving forwards, we want to be rigorous in our approach. We want to take these lessons learned very seriously, and we want to see how we can build on them and use and develop and you know, facilitate more spaces of learning that really, where we can unpack some of these recommendations. I think some of that they're not necessarily groundbreaking in the sense that it's not that they haven't been said before. But what was so clear was that it was the case studies, this compilation of case studies. It's from the case studies directly lifted that these recommendations really speak so strongly. And that is what we want to try and do, ensure that we can convene spaces where different voices come through and can be heard moving forward. So I think with that, I'm really, really pleased about today's discussion. Thank you so much for sharing these insights. And just finally, this issue about how do we bring foresight, you know, more systematically into decision-making spaces. And for us, and I mean, it's you know, at the UN, it's at the top of our mind. That's why we were created as the UN Futures Lab. How can we try and ensure that foresight is being consistently incorporated in these decision-making spaces? And Elena, your points about you know, the institutionalization and ensuring that scenarios, you know, that they're built, the flexibility is built in to revisit them and adapt them as time moves on. I think that is so important. And then Anantha, as you were saying, you know, but what if people just are not interested and there is this bias? How can we ensure that we can move past this and ensure that it's really this sort of this educational approach? So thank you so much, and yeah, it's been fantastic, and looking forward to more of these as we move forward. Chris, back over to you.
Thanks, Alana. Thanks, Anne-Sophie, and just a huge thank you to the panelists for being engaged in this session, for sharing your insights and your lessons learnt. It was extremely valuable, I think, for all of us. I'd also like to say thank you to the audience for joining us today. We did run over slightly with our discussion, which gave us a little bit less time for the Mentimeter and questions and so on and so forth. But you can get in touch with us directly, either at the International Science Council you see on the right, many ways to contact them, or with the UN Futures Lab on the left, slightly fewer ways to contact us, but all of them effective, which is the great news for all of us. So if you've got questions on the report, you want to get in touch, you've got suggestions, comments, things you don't agree with, as well as things you do, please do get in touch with us at the International Science Council or at the UN Futures Lab. And then the last point that I would like to make is, you know, when we're using strategic foresight, when we're using futures thinking, of course we need to have critical minds, and we need to critique our approaches, we need to question our underlying assumptions, and we need to certainly have the confidence to question those underlying assumptions. And so this is part of a series of work that we carry out with partners, excellent partners such as the International Science Council, to really interrogate how we're trying to use strategic foresight and futures thinking at the UN Futures Lab. We know that we need to be better in all of our approaches, and so the more that we can uncover and learn from effective approaches, whether you call it strategic foresight or futures thinking, essentially, how do we understand what a diversity of people are thinking about the future. That's our job over here at the UN Futures Lab. So thank you to the audience, thank you to the panelists, thank you to the International Science Council for being a fantastic partner. Thank you to all of the folks who submitted your case studies. We've got a mountain of data that we are currently using to adjust our approaches and so on and so forth. Watch this space. There's going to be more opportunities to submit case studies, tell this community what needs to be done differently, and so on and so forth. But with that, I'm going to close this session out. Wish you all lovely evenings, afternoons, mornings, and so on and so forth. Have great rests of your day. That's it from us. Bye-bye.